and I guess I got a little confused too, even though I know y'all are on Eastern time. Do you know when you're driving in and your phone, sometimes it changes and sometimes it doesn't? And then I got here and I was like, I still don't know what time it is. And then I couldn't find the extension office, but I found the library, so I made it. But I did happen to stop by one nursery on the way in too, because I'm the plant guy, and people were asking me, "What are you, the chocolate expert? What do you know about chocolate?" I really don't. In fact, y'all, this is bad. I don't even like chocolate. But there's only 10% of people that don't like chocolate. But this class came out. I teach a horticulture class in Anniston at the Juvenile Detention Center, and every week we have a program on something environment or horticulture related, and usually the week of Valentine's Day we do a class on chocolate. And when I evaluate my classes at the end, it's always at the top of the list. So I decided to move it into the adult world, and we were discussing a program for Russell County. I said, let's try this one. I'm going to do it at our botanical garden in Anniston. So we'll get started. Just that image right there, just most people, your stomach growls, your mouth waters, and you see so much. You know, I was, of course, cruising around the internet the other day, and I saw a story, and I don't know, it said that chocolate is a better cure for cough than cough syrup. Like that. And yeah, so, yeah. Of course, we always talk about dark chocolate, but just these images right here kind of just makes your mouth water for most people. Of course, I would go for the white chocolate. Now, I do like white chocolate. Of course, death by chocolate. And we put chocolate on anything. Potato chips, pretzels, of course, the fruit. Of course, now you see these strawberries that are shipped right to your door for Valentine's Day that are often dipped in different types of chocolate. And we'll talk about this process a little later on when they talk about enrobing, when they put chocolate on different things. Of course, this is the iconic scene that I always think of. And chocolate is always is something that we always, I think everybody from a child, it's in our lives almost constantly, from the holidays to TV and entertainment. But this is what chocolate starts out. This is the fruit of the cacao tree, and it looks nothing a lot like what you would think. You know, a lot of times most people think the fruit hanging on the tree. These actually will grow attached to the trunk. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the botany because I'm a botanist and horticulturist, and that's what really got me interested in chocolate. And I loved growing tropical plants, but this one is really, really tropical. In fact, when we get the name, the genus on it is Theobroma, which Theos means God. Broma means, bromus is food, so the actual translation of this is food of the gods. And you'll see when we talk about the history, that's where there's a whole story in the history of chocolate that will tie you to that fact. So, of course, the specific epithet is cacao, which comes from the indigenous name. Anybody know where the chocolate comes from? Like most northern South America and Central America. And like I said, if y'all have questions, I love questions. Just raise your hand, blurt it out, and we'll address those. So please feel free. But here we are. This is the cacao tree where chocolate comes from, Theobroma cacao. And you can see now, do you notice some of those fruits are different colors? That fruit can vary in color. It can be red or purple, brown, yellow to orange, just a rainbow of different colors.
How big are they? They look really big, but I'm sure.
They're in this range.
Wow.
Football size?
Excuse me?
Football size?
Not quite that big, but close. It depends on, I guess a small football. But they're typically like this, like that size.
Do they only grow off the trunk?
They're typically on the branches in the trunk. And now, can anybody think of a tree that does that grows around here, that flowers on the trunk? Anybody ever noticed a redbud tree? They will flower along the trunk, and they'll go on up the branches too. But it's more typical. I tend to see it more in tropical species. But this is a nice sized cacao tree with that bold tropical foliage. You can see that beautiful new growth. And this is the native range of a cacao tree. You can see it's in Central America and northern South America. And I've got a pointer here. So in this area right through here. So that's where all the trees are native to, in that area. Of course, like I said, the fruit is what they grow it for. You can see it hanging. The flowers, what do you think they smell like? No, they don't. Sorry. They have no fragrance. They actually, you would think they would have some fragrance, but they don't. You would assume it smells like when you open that Hershey bar, it smells just like chocolate. But there they are. That's the flower. They're kind of small compared to what the fruit looks like, but not much fragrance at all. And you can see these are harvested fruit, and you can see the variation in color.
Question here.
Uh-huh.
What is the typical age of a tree? Do you know how long they live?
I right offhand, they're not a really long-lived tree compared to a lot of your trees that usually the longer-lived trees are slower growing, but it's not going to be a short-lived tree either. And I do recall seeing that most of the trees that we see now are smaller. A lot of the older trees in our forests where they're native, those forests a lot of those areas have been destroyed, so you lose a lot of your old majestic trees, even like we have here. We just don't see the big trees like they were probably like that were here 1,000 years ago. But
I have a question. Because of various colors, does it have the indication what type of soil is growing in the color change?
This is more genetics of the tree, and each tree will produce it's just in the genetics, so it's not soil reactive. Like I always think of hydrangeas, how you can with the pH that will change the flower color, but this is more of a just a variation. And if you look at apples, we get green apples and yellow apples and different shades of red, and this would be something of that sort. It's just a variety. And this is the right pod, and when you split that pod open, there are those seeds, and they've got that gelatinous seed coat on there. And the seeds are what we call cacao beans or cocoa beans. So that's where we get the name, and it comes from the seed that comes from the inside of this pod. So what you have to do is remove that pod, and I've heard that the fruit has a little bit of sweetness too, but it's nothing like the prepared beans. But you can see the seed. And it has to go through a process, and that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today, of how those seeds or cocoa beans are processed.
How do you know when to harvest those?
Well, it could be a little tricky, because if some of them are yellow and green, you don't know exactly when they're ripe. I grew a tomato last year called Brad's Atomic Grape, and it was kind of a greenish yellow, and we never knew when it was ripe. So I decided we weren't going to grow it and sell it again at our plant sale, because everybody called me, how do I know when it's ripe? But I guess over time when you work, if these people that do this for a living, they can and the thing in a tropical climate, you don't have as much of a season like we have. So it's perpetual. So it's constantly flowering and producing fruit. But it's going to be probably by the color and the texture of the fruit that when it's ripe. I couldn't do it. Like I said, I'm a horticulturist, but I'm far from a chocolate farmer. But I have an interest in this. And when we get into the production, well, I'll talk a little bit more about that too, a little bit about how when they harvest it. And that's the part that really interests me. And of course, here's a nursery, and you can see where they grow some of the seedlings from the beans. And like I said, they have a very limited range. It's about 20 degrees north and south of the equator is where chocolate can be grown worldwide. And most of the chocolate we consumed today is grown in Western African countries down near the equator, and they produce about 70% of the chocolate in what we call the cocoa belt. And there's the cocoa belt. That's the shaded area. So that's the areas within 20 degrees. But does that mean you can grow it in all these areas? Not really, because you have elevation changes, you have dry climates that are, and this is a truly tropical plant. It doesn't want temperatures below 70. That's kind of me. And of course, I don't want them above 75. Is that too much to ask? I don't like winter, and of course, I'll take summer over winter any day.
So the African growth is cultured, it's not native?
It is not native, and we're going to look. See, these are all the areas where it can be grown, all within that distance of the equator. And if you remember the map, it's only native. It's only native in this area right here. So out of its native areas, it's just kind of in this little strip across the globe where where temperatures don't drop below 70. Of course, and like we said, more than half, which is in this little area of Africa, the Ivory Coast and Ghana produce a large chunk of the chocolate that we consume. And you can see these countries right here. Right here. Of course, we look at the history of chocolate, and it's really interesting when you go back and you start. We know that if you go back to 1900 BCE, that's before Common Era, where we have been able to test carbon date chocolate in utensils. So we know exactly that it was being consumed at that time. And this was in the Mayan culture. Do y'all know where the Mayans, where were they?
Mexico.
Where? Mexico. Do you know what area of Mexico?
Southern.
Exactly, yeah. When you take that little cruise, anybody taking that cruise, you can stop at Cozumel and you can see those ruins. It's that Yucatan Peninsula that kind of sticks up in the Gulf of Mexico, which is a really tropical climate. So they were growing cocoa, or utilizing cocoa beans back to this era in time. Now, like we said, we have in this area over here, which is the lowland tropics, which are the Mayans. And then we have this Aztecs that are in the area where, like Mexico City, and this is high elevation. And it gets a little too cold to grow the chocolate, but they still love their chocolate, you know. They both, and what happened is as the Aztecs conquered the Mayans, they would actually utilize the chocolate and bring it to this higher mountain climate where they could consume it. And because then it was kind of more of a thing of the royalty. So we know that the Mayans started utilizing the chocolate in that lowland tropical. These are the chocolate pots that they would use. They would mix it with water, the ground cocoa beans, and they'd put a little pepper in there, and they would often pour it from great heights to make it foam and froth, and that's how they would drink it, in that foamy, frothy drink. They even made hot chocolate mugs shaped just like the cocoa fruit. They even used the beans as currency. So, you know, they would trade 5 beans for a rabbit, and I guess it goes up from there. But they would utilize those beans as an amount of currency in their economic system there. Of course, like I said, the Aztecs conquered the Mayans, and as that the Mayans were actually overruled, and they would often charge them a tax, because and they would pay that tax, and guess what they would pay it with? Cocoa beans. So they would take those cocoa beans up to the Aztec, up to the main city, up there, up in the mountains, where they could make their zacalado or chocolado, which was the drink they loved to drink as well. And they often added the pepper to it. They often believed that the Quetzal, I could see if I could say this, Quetzalcoatl. Y'all wouldn't even know if I messed that up, would you? It's one of those tongue twisters. This is who they believed that chocolate was a gift from this one of their gods, the feathered serpent god. So you have this god in the image of has these bright feathers, and he's really just a mythical creature, and that's how they believed that the cacao was a gift from the gods. So that's how we get the food of the gods. But what happened in 1519, Hernan Cortes lands in Mexico. And do you see what he's wearing? He's got feathers. They thought he was the god. So he came in with some street cred. He's got, they see this guy dressed and they think, this is him. This is our God. So guess what they do? They take him to the city, and he's treated with such fanfare and given chocolate. But it turns out he didn't like it so much, but he kind of became familiar with it. So, but because of this mistaken identity, he was not killed, and they were able to conquer. And we had the introduction of diseases from the Europeans. So as we established the Europeans in Mexico, we had kind of the suffering of the native people through these diseases, and they were conquered through trade. But chocolate goes back to Spain as trading routes were increased in 1528. And did I mention Columbus brought coffee back prior? But you know what happened? They thought it was sheep poop, and they threw it overboard. So you can kind of see they had no idea what it was. They didn't realize that this was one of the great finds that they brought back from the Americas. But by the 1600s, chocolate is in the European culture as a drink. And they established cocoa houses, like coffee houses. And because it was more of the wealthy, they charged import duties. So it costs quite a bit to have coffee or cocoa in your home. And it was even popular in the court of King Charles II. So here we are now, the 1650s, and you're really starting to see chocolate being consumed in Europe. And you ask, well, how did how did they do that? They often processed it into a powder. So this is the first cocoa powder, and then they could add it and almost make like an instant chocolate. And of course, they would often add a little bit of sugar, because some people, it was kind of an acquired taste. It's kind of like, how coffee is to some people, how we like, you put cream and sugar in your coffee, but those crazy people that drink it straight up black. So I'm not a big coffee drinker, but you put enough latte and stuff in it, I guess. I do have a horrible sweet tooth. But in America, we didn't really see chocolate. It was kind of came popular during the Revolutionary War. And it was often included in rations, and a lot of times they were paid in lieu of cash. They would give them chocolate. So that's how Americans were kind of introduced at first. And it was in 1828. This is when they invented the cocoa press. And this is a device that actually takes the nibs, that's what we call those beans, and it kind of it allows the oil to be removed, and then you have this fine powder like this. So it becomes easier to process, and you have this all of these introductions of new processes of developing chocolate, and then we finally got the first chocolate bar. So this was in 1847 by the Fry and Son Company, and this bar was made by mixing the cocoa powder with sugar, and then they would add back that melted cocoa butter that was extracted from the beans. That's a cool ring, though. I like it. So we had a lot of our big chocolate companies come into development at this time. And who's heard of Cadbury Chocolate? Yeah. And I'll tell you, if you go on their website, they have a great history of chocolate, and you can follow through how the company started as a chocolate house, and how they introduced the solid chocolates, and how it developed, how they almost lost everything, and then there was the resurgence, through some bad economic times, but Cadbury is still there today. Of course, milk chocolate was invented in 1875. And of course, you'll recognize these names. This guy named Daniel Peter with the Nestle Company, and he was the first to add condensed milk solids to chocolate. So, and I think the story goes they had a chocolate factory and there happened to be a dairy next door, so it was real convenient. So they were messing around and started adding the milk, the sweetened milk to the chocolate, and you get this wonderful. Now, I'll eat milk chocolate, especially like a Reese's cup, or if it has other flavors in it, it's not so bad. But I'm just not one of those that goes, I don't crave chocolate, and like the worst thing is chocolate pudding and chocolate ice cream or a Frosty. I just don't do those.
We're very sorry.
Yeah, so that's more for y'all, more for y'all. Then you have this guy, you've heard of Lindt chocolate, right? So you're seeing these names. He accidentally invented Conching, which is a grinding of the chocolate. And what happened, he left his machine on over the weekend, basically. And he came back, and it turns out that the constant grinding actually really did a lot for the process of chocolate. It made it smooth, and it gave it more flavor and texture. So that's where sometimes we learn by accident, and that's okay. And of course, Henri Nestle was with the Nestle Company. So these are the guys. That's you can blame these guys if you have a chocolate addiction to milk chocolate, because they were the ones that really developed that. So around the turn of the century, you're looking at 1900, we start to get more chocolate companies coming in, like Mars, Ghirardelli. If you've ever, how many of y'all been to Ghirardelli? That's one of my favorite places. Yeah. And of course, Hershey's, which is another big attraction if you're in the Pennsylvania area to go to the Hershey's. I heard if you live in Hershey, Pennsylvania, you smell chocolate all the time. Is that true? So, yeah. So we started, this is 1900, so you're starting to see the candy market really come forward. But there's also a dark side, and when we started, you look at the history of chocolate, and this is where I really delve in to the history of chocolate with my students. And as chocolate plantations began, the existence of slavery at that time, they would use the slave labor because it is very labor intensive, and they would take the slaves from Western Africa and that they were placed and made to work for the chocolate companies. So chocolate had there was the dark side, and these were the growing regions where chocolate was being grown. But what has happened, we've kind of shifted back toward Africa in the latter part of this century. We're 72, like I said, more than half of it, mostly in the Ivory Coast and Ghana. This is where they're growing chocolate. But what we're seeing is a lot of child, and still today a lot of child and slave labor, because like you said, it is a constant. There's not a particular one harvest time, and we're in countries that have poor, and the wages are very low. So what they're doing, and this is what I do, this is a company, we follow this company, it's out of Ireland, that has made a co-op, and we know what co-op from being with Extension is. They work together, and what they've gone and to do is to work with the farms, and they'll go into a whole community and help develop that community, and everyone works together, so the whole community actually feels the support of the economical gains that they get. And they've made the children, they'll go in and build schools, so the children actually go to school. They outlaw the child labor, and so they really have tried to make the chocolate industry a better industry. And you can go online, and there's the slavefreechocolate.org and greenamerica.org, but you can see the problem of the issues where the growers and the workers were only getting 5%, and it is heavy labor intensive. Like I said, it's year-round, it's constant, and it takes a lot of work, and you'll see that when we look at the process. So they're trying to even this out a little bit. So,
is there something we can look at on the label now?
well, the thing is research, and always be a good consumer and do your research and go to organizations and be thorough. Look for good sources, And that's why, and I pulled this up. This was from 2017, and a lot of the companies are trying to move toward, by 2020, to have a better practice of chocolate production. And you can see that some of these, like this, and I've seen this endangered species chocolate before. But you can see that, and just research. Always be a good consumer and research. As you can see, some of the other companies have poor grades, but all the this is from 2017. So always check it in and make sure they're moving forward and doing things the way. And that's why I said I hate to bring bad news with chocolate, but that's where the consumer comes in, and do your research. So you've heard me mention cacao and cocoa, and there's a difference, and I was going to show you this before we get started on the processes. Cacao beans are the actual dried beans, and they're fermented, and they're heated at much lower temperatures, and then the heat will separate the fatty part, which is like the cocoa butter, and that's how cacao is. And it's a little more often chunky. And the good thing about it, it has more antioxidants, and you can use it as a chocolate chip replacement. Cocoa butter is, of course, that's one of the best things. I use that on my skin too. It is a good moisturizer for your skin. And of course, I think it's cut off the con part is that it's not as sweet. So that's just some of the natural flavorings that are not removed that give it a little less sweetness. When you get cocoa powder, how many of you, a kid, went into your parents' kitchen and took a big spoonful of that? I did that, and that may be why I do not like chocolate to this day. And I remember she had the little baker's chocolate, and I ate that too. Oh, it was awful. But cocoa, that's cocoa powder, and it's really the same thing, except that it's at a little higher heat, and it's more sweeter because some of those volatile oils come out, and it's a great way to introduce the chocolate flavor in baking. But it is, being more processed, it's going to have fewer of the nutrients and less antioxidants. So everybody knows what's the best type of chocolate to eat if you want the health. This is the dark, pure cacao. That's what you want. So when you go to buy chocolate and you're trying to rationalize it as a health food, cacao. So let's look at how it's made. So I've always been fascinated. Do you remember the show called How It's Made? I used to love it. And actually, that show is what gave me the kind of the encouragement to do this, because it was, I love seeing how things are made. And I said, this would be a great class for my horticulture for the kids. So, and it has really worked out. It looks like it works for adults too, so we're good. But the whole process begins out in our belt of 20 degrees either side of the equator, where they can grow the chocolate. Is they've got to harvest that fruit. And you can tell, to me, that these pictures of the fruit, that all those different colors to me it's just amazing. You can see the reds and the yellows, and of course they have to be hand harvested, and a lot of times with knives. And of course, and you can imagine being a child climbing one of these trees with a sharp knife. There were a lot of injuries, and it can be very dangerous. Also, working in these jungles, you run into all kinds of venomous insects or poisonous spiders and venomous snakes. So there's always that hazard of working outdoors, as much as I love doing it too. Of course, chocolate, once you remove that, remember we have to remove that pulpy seed. It has to go through a fermentation process. So they're set up and they're allowed to ferment for a few days, and then they're dried. They're kind of put out in the sun to naturally dry. So after that, they are graded and selected. You want the highest quality beans that will go to your most expensive chocolates. And of course, that's just the seed, the actual seed from the fruit. And we call that a nib or the bean, and because it looks kind of like a bean. And then they have to be, they're often rotated and winnowed. Do you know what that process is? It's actually, so you get a clean seed, and then they grind. And as you grind, you can see it creates that almost like a chocolate liqueur. And when you're refining, remember we talked about conching. That's the process of grinding chocolate over a long period of time. And this is a slide that compares at 2 hours, 4 hours, 15 hours, and then a good 30 hour or so. It can go on to get the finer chocolate that has, it's basically like when you have sand and those particles get smaller and they get rounded, you have a finer sand. This gives you a finer chocolate. And it also allows some of those volatile oils to come out. Remember how it's not as sweet, but as some of that is released, you get a sweeter flavor. And then you have tempering. That's when everybody goes, ooh, ah, yeah. And what is tempering? Tempering is a process of melting and cooling so it becomes smooth and glossy. And believe it or not, we love that smooth. Look at that strawberry with that smooth, glossy chocolate. And then if I cooked it, it would look like the one. It would be all granulated and lumpy and clumpy. And then you can see how it just gives you a finer looking product, and it's a smoother coating that gives a better tasting and a more visually appealing. They can also at this stage they do molding where they can pour the chocolate in the molds. And often they'll put different types of filling. My grandmother was notorious that she'd take that big box of Whitman's, and before they put the mat, she'd punch a hole on the bottom of it, and if it wasn't like what she wanted, she'd put it back, and you couldn't tell. So she was smart at that, and she taught me that trick. But you can get the different types of filling. Of course, and then they often mold them into bars. And of course, we get all the different shapes of different. I know there's the shape of the chocolate bar. I know what's the one, the Toblerone, has the triangular shaped and things. Or you can not shape them. Sometimes you can just spoon them out and get these little chocolate drops, and that's how they got the inspiration for the Hershey's Kiss. It's just the drop of chocolate. Of course, there's a whole science to it with that machine now. Of course, let's look at the types of chocolate. And as you can see, we usually think of white chocolate, dark chocolate, and milk chocolate. And dark chocolate, like I said, is the healthy. It's the healthiest chocolate. It's supposed to do all these wonderful things, and it slows the signs of aging. So now But you always, I'm going to, at the end of this, you've got to say, with moderation, right? And I hate that part, right? I know. It's also lower your blood pressure and controls blood sugar, believe it or not. The dark chocolate, and it has to do with the antioxidants and all the different nutrients that are in the dark cocoa. You can see it has a lot of vitamins and minerals, and as you can see, there's a whole list of things. Of course, the antidepressant agents, I guess you put a box of chocolate in front of anybody and they're going to be happy for the most part. But it's also, and I was mentioning earlier that they're finding that chocolate actually is better for a cough than some cough medicine. So that's amazing. Dark chocolate. So milk chocolate is really... is, like we said, it came from the addition of condensed milk and back in 1876. And this is really what pushed chocolate out to the masses. And you had the whole process that became cheaper as it became more available. And then you've got it where you can, it's just with the sweet flavor, and it becomes a standard in American life and candy stores and holidays. Like I said, of course, once they did the conching, that's really what was the last major breakthrough in chocolate. And like it is, it's that rolling that mixture side to side and creating and grinding those particles down to where they're smooth, and those oils are able to evaporate to give it that sweeter flavor. And like I said, I covered that. The legend that the lint process was a mistake. He left that machine on all weekend. So there's the original machine right there. So like we said, when you conch the chocolate, it reduces that moisture content. It allows that moisture to evaporate. Those oils and other ingredients that give it the little bit of a bitterness are allowed to evaporate. It reduces the acidity. It also rounds off those particles. Like I said, instead of a smoother, you get those strawberries that are glossy and have a nice enrobing effect. And the flavor is more fully developed, and they permeate the cocoa butter more fully. So you get that best flavor from conching. Then there's white chocolate. Who likes white chocolate here? Some people say it's not even chocolate, but I'd like white chocolate. I could eat all the white chocolate. I always, especially you get me a white chocolate chip macadamia cookie. Oh my goodness. But it's thought, and this is, they don't know exactly when, but the Swiss invented white chocolate in the 1930s, and as a process of dealing with excess cocoa butter. So white chocolate contains no cocoa solids, so it doesn't have any of those effects. So it's just fat, sweet goodness. And National White Chocolate Day is September 22nd for all those like me that don't care so much for dark chocolate. But it's interesting, the FDA established the standard in response to petitions filed by the Hershey Company and other chocolate manufacturers that white chocolate must be 20% cocoa butter. So to have true white chocolate, it's 20% cocoa butter. Chocolate must be 10% cocoa solids, otherwise it's just candy. So we have these definitions. So if you leave anything today, you know, I demand my 10% or I demand my 20%. But guess what? Who's heard of ruby chocolate? I just crashed your day, didn't I? You had no idea. Now everybody you can go on eBay and buy ruby chocolate. But some people say it's a scam. But I want to, and this is an interesting story. Ruby chocolate was supposedly introduced in 2017 by this guy with a Belgian Swiss cocoa company. And he says he uses ruby cocoa beans. Some people argue it's not really chocolate, and basically you know how he says they're proprietary, these are my cocoa beans, but it's probably a red or pink form, just like we have, we're about to have apples that when you bite into them, they're pink on the inside. We're always introducing new stuff like that. Of course, this is a pink chocolate bean. They don't actually process it, so it doesn't have that 10% cocoa. They use that more of the cocoa butter that has that pink coloration. So a lot of people say it's not really chocolate. But they introduced it as a Kit Kat, and these things auctioned off for like unreal amounts of money. But if you want, I think you can go now and pay $6.95 and order a ruby chocolate Kit Kat bar on eBay or Amazon, but it's out there. So if you get bored today and you're at work and you get online, or if you're at home and you want to try a ruby chocolate and just see, it's an excuse to eat something sweet, I guess, right? Mm-hmm. So today we know that the average American consumes 12 pounds of chocolate each year. 12 pounds! And more than $75 billion worldwide is spent on chocolate annually. And of course, we've got Valentine's coming up this week. That's probably one of the biggest times that we consume chocolate. Yeah, it's always there. Of course, National Chocolate Day is the 28th of October, and so if you feel you need to celebrate that, you can. Of course. Of course, any day's good. And like I said, 10% of people, that's including me, don't care for chocolate. And like I said, I'll eat a milk chocolate or something like that, but it's just that chocolate cake, chocolate pudding, that chocolate flavor, the real chocolate, I just find too bitter. I don't even eat, So, and the worst is chocolate pudding. To me, that's just, ugh. We used to get that in school, and I was just like, ugh. I always had to trade it for French fries or something. But anyway, so you know now, 10% of people hate chocolate. But whether you enjoy it as hot chocolate, or if you like ice cream, or in just any type of other way, it's always enjoyable if you love it.